So this is a paper that is trying to connect two phrases that you don't often hear connected. One is insurance and the other is financial aid. And because I'm an American, and I teach at a place like Dartmouth, which is a small private institution, I have a very particular notion of what this means, and it bears some explanation. In the United States, there are public universities and private universities. Many of the private universities have a sticker price that is very high. I started writing this paper in its earliest stages 5 years ago. That sticker price for the cost of attendance was about $60,000. At Dartmouth, it is now north of $70,000. I'm still sticking with the 60 because I have kids approaching college age. I just don't want to have to think about all that stuff just yet. The way in which that sticker price is discounted in the United States typically depends on a financial aid formula. There are two main ones that are used. One is something called FAFSA, the Free Application for Federal Student Aid, and the other is an institutional methodology, which has a more comprehensive definition of assets and a few other changes. But the key part of both is that if you show up on the eve of your children attending college with more assets or more income, you're going to get less aid, you're going to pay more for college. If you showed up with fewer assets or lower income, you'll get more aid, you'll pay less for college. Okay, so we're economists, many of us in this room, and so the moment you hear that, you're trained to think, well, that's ridiculous. If I had the choice, why would I show up with any assets? All that's going to do is make me pay more for college. Or why would I work and earn income when there's this tax that is implicit in this formula on my earning income? And so as you can imagine, there's a literature that has developed which has said, hey, wait a minute, this is basically redistribution. And I know whenever there are taxes that involve redistribution, that means there's also disincentives created. Okay, so that's fine. I'm not saying that those don't exist. And both arise because of the means testing inherent in a formula like that. Okay, so that's fine, and that's the literature so far. But we know, because of who we are in this room and what we study, that anytime you distort incentives for things that people can control, to the extent any of that quantity is uncertain, then you're also providing insurance. So instead of really focusing on the redistribution incentives trade-off, we know there's an incentives insurance trade-off, and it just so happens that no one has ever looked at what the insurance value of financial aid turns out to be. Okay, so I've hinted at this. We've known this in other contexts. The first time I think this broke into publications was in the early 1980s, in the wake of a decade of results in optimal tax theory, in which you were getting results like very low or zero marginal tax rate at the top, because when you unpack models like that, the differences in income that you observe are due to underlying ability. What particularly Varian's paper showed was that if those differences are due to randomness or luck, then your result about low marginal tax rate at the top, that's going to go away. The marginal tax rate is going to be quite high because you can provide insurance in that way. So I think as you sort of trace that literature, and I've been, I think, very selective, I've picked the highlights for me. The Hubbard-Skinner-Zeldis paper, to me, was an enormous eye-opener in terms of means-tested social insurance crowding out saving. Engen and Gruber did a similar type of experiment on unemployment insurance. More recently, the Rostam, Afshar, and Yao paper on progressive taxation, and particularly this Thria, Riley, and Simpson paper. I mean, they show that saving is lower, consumption volatility is lower, labor supply is higher in the presence of the earned income tax credit, which is sort of a work subsidy that operates at very low incomes in the United States. So the literature is starting to form where it considers the insurance value inherent in fiscal policy choices. Okay, so putting a pin in that and moving back to the literature. So these people who've talked about financial aid, what have they actually said? So this term, the financial aid tax, this idea that if you show up with an additional dollar of assets and you're subject to the financial aid formula, you're going to lose aid. That goes back to Case and McPherson in 1986. And then there was a great Journal of Economic Perspectives paper by Aaron Edlin in 1993, which I'll return to, which sort of made the economic case for this as being problematic. There was a paper by Marty Feldstein in the AER in 1995, who, the moment he realized there was a disincentive to saving inherent in anything, reached in to try to test for what the empirical effects are. His paper found that asset accumulation was reduced by about 50% for those facing the marginal incentives, and that result has not turned out to be particularly robust in the later studies that have looked at it. As far as I can tell, the analogous implicit tax on labor income has received less attention. But for one paper that I was able to find that looked at whether people delay their retirement associated with having kids in college, I could find nothing. Certainly nothing about the pre-retirement within period labor leisure trade-off. So that is not something that's in the literature. And I won't read this, but if you go back and you read Feldstein's paper, he acknowledges that there's uncertainty that would affect the problem, but then it's finessed and it's not included in any of the empirical work. Okay, so that's the opening in the literature, I think. And so if I were to walk away from this and say, what did you learn? I'm really always going to say that the consequence here is that you should look at welfare before you look at behavior, understanding that behavior is an input to welfare, and that's what we care about. And if you think that's not true, you probably haven't specified welfare in the way that you should. Okay. And so the test for this effort is that we should be able to show that in the absence of insurance, right, and so there I can just shut off the income uncertainty in the model, the only thing you would be left with would be the disincentives inherent in the financial aid formula. But then as you add back in an insurance value, the means testing will also generate insurance, and in a sense I've set up a horse race. Are the welfare reducing consequences of these disincentives to save prior to the kid being in college or to work while the kid is in college, are those large relative to the insurance value that is provided by the same implicit marginal tax rates? And so I come from the school of nutrition that says you eat dessert first, and so I will just show you what that looks like, and then I will tell you how the cake was baked. What I have here is in the model the initial value of the state variable, which is what is your income at the beginning of the life cycle. And you can immediately see that I'm using rather high numbers, right? So it's from 50 to 200,000, and then the height of each bar is the average amount of financial aid you would get in a model in which there's a lot of income uncertainty, and so in some cases your income turns out to be high, you accumulate assets, you get very little aid. In other cases, your income turns out to be low, your assets don't turn out to be high, and you get a lot of aid. And so obviously the blue bars should be declining as you just shift the starting point of income in those simulations from low to high. And what you can see is that even at an initial value of income of $200,000, there's still, on average, about $8,000 worth of aid being provided. Why is that happening? Right? It's happening because you start out with 200 and then you start getting disproportionately negative realizations to the income process, and so you sort of fall into the range where aid is provided, right? And you're taking an average across those scenarios relative to scenarios where you don't get unlucky, and thus you don't get any aid. Okay, and so that's the result of the model with a formula that approximates what we currently have. What should be the comparison? What should be the counterfactual? Well, what I have in mind in this paper is that instead of giving you a financial aid formula, right, which conditions or means tests on assets and income, I would just give you the blue bar, right? So if you are the person who starts out with $50,000 of household income, I'm just going to give you, as it turns out, $50,000 worth of aid against the total cost of attendance, which was at the low price in 2013 of $60,000. And so you just face $10,000 to go to Dartmouth, regardless of what your assets and income turn out to be. And so I can solve the model once with the current formula, once with that counterfactual, and I can ask, so at the beginning of the program, is lifetime welfare higher or lower? Right? If lifetime welfare is higher in that counterfactual, it means that the distortions to your saving and labor decisions were important and the insurance value not so large. If it turns out that you're worse off, then I would ask the question, well, how much higher would I have to make the blue bar in order to leave you as well off as you were under the original formula? So I'm going for exactly a compensating variation. Okay, and so since this is dessert, I show you that what those compensating variations turn out to be. So what this means is that if I gave you the current formula, and you started out your working career with $100,000 of household income, on average you'd be getting about $31,600 of aid. If I took away the assets and income linked elements of that, and I wanted to make you just as well off, how big would the grant have to be? And the answer is $41,400, a difference of $9,800. And so in a sense, that's money coming from the aid provider, right? So if you were my employer, you would say, how can we design our aid program such that for a given amount of money, we make our potential student body as well off as possible, right? And the answer would not be, get rid of all the asset and income links in that formula, right? That's all this has told you. So you see that the red bars that stack on top of the blue bars are always positive. So it's saying that for this particular parameterization, the insurance value is always sufficiently large that whatever welfare consequences of those disincentives there are, they are small relative to the insurance value. Okay, so that is the main point of the paper, that the red bars are positive and that they're robustly positive across the different starting points. And so now if you want to see the comparison, the purple bars that are going down, those are the ones that arise in the same way as the red ones, but when there's no income uncertainty in the model. And you can see that those numbers range from $500 to, say, $3,600, and in several cases are zero or close to it. All right, the reason why it's zero here is because if you started out with $200,000 and faced no income uncertainty, there's never a scenario in which you get financial aid. So whether you got that zero in an income and asset linked manner or just zero doesn't matter. And at the same point, at the $50,000, you're always getting aid, right? And so there's no insurance value available to you because it happens with a certainty. Okay, so if you wanted a notion of what the gross insurance value of financial aid is, it would be, you would stack the two bars, but that's very imprecise, right? Because it's two different parameterizations. And so I always put this in my presentations. If you remember only one thing, which is not a how-to guide, but just a form of insurance, I guess, for me, looked at when the child is 18, financial aid award is just money for college. Looked at when the kid is 3 weeks old, the financial aid formula is insurance against subsequent income risk. And the point of the paper is to show that the second is a sizable increment to the value of the first, even net of the welfare consequences of disincentives to work and save. And so that's what I mean when I say this is the insurance value of financial aid. So the case that I highlighted, it suggested that the insurance value is 30% above and beyond the dollar value because of the way that it's delivered. To be done, everything in this paper is just an illustration, right? I believe I've pulled the parameters from reasonable values found in the literature, but none of this has been calibrated to actual data. This is the paper that just illustrates the concept in as clear a manner as I can do it. And there is no optimization in the paper, right? If you were an aid provider and you had a particular conception of the aid recipient's welfare, right? In my case, I've done it completely ex ante. It's just not clear that in admitting its class, Dartmouth is trying to maximize the well-being of the students' families as they existed 20 years ago. So that is also embedded. But there is an interesting optimization problem, so So what do you learn about the optimal way to construct financial aid in this way? Okay, so how do we get there? I should tell you a little bit about this formula. The formula has two main inputs. The first input is related to income. It is called your available income. That starts with the concept of adjusted gross income, and it subtracts a bunch of allowances. The most important part about that is that these allowances for federal, state, and payroll taxes, those themselves are sensitive to income. So as you're computing what is the implicit means testing, it's a little more complicated than just what the numbers in the formula are. It depends on these underlying elements. There's also a contribution from assets. So every year, 12% of the assets that are in the eligible category are contributed to adjusted available income. Adjusted available income goes to something called the expected family contribution by way of, this is just the full way to say, piecewise linear spline, that comes in at 47% as a slope, and that becomes the maximum slope at about $30,000 in that year. And so that's a very low threshold for the maximum conversion rate to happen. Okay, so the fundamentals that are going into the model are, this is literally the derivative of the expected family contribution with respect to assets, it's that partial derivative at different values of income. And what you can see is that over the period where this is, over the range where this is increasing, it's increasing at about 7% per year. Right, because that is basically the 47% times 12% plus whatever you've assumed the rate of return on assets are. That comes in through the income part, but is still attendant to having the assets. So 7% per year for 4 years on the declining balance gives you roughly a 25% implicit tax rate. This is the analogous concept for labor income. So each different curve represents a different level of assets, and this is the derivative of the expected family contribution with respect to labor income. And you can see those lines over most of the range. They're parallel also, and they're at a slope of about 30%. And so that's the 47% times 1 minus the income sensitivity of all those allowances. All right, so if you imagine that those marginal tax rates were a third, 2/3 of 47 is about the 30 number that you get there. Okay, and since those allowances have been netted out, for households that have a child in school that are subject to the financial aid formula, it's as if there's an additional 30% tax on labor income in those years. And that has basically received no attention, even in standard public finance models, is surprising to me. Okay, and so how do we model that? I'm going to have a life cycle model with 2 state variables, assets and income. Lucky for me, they line up almost exactly with what goes into the formula. There's going to be within each period 2 choices, consumption and labor supply. The key parts of the budget constraint are that there's a planned drop in income at retirement, there's uncertainty in pre-retirement income, there's college tuition payments for the household's children, and there's a stylized version of the financial aid model in there. Oddly, and this is why I'm not doing marketing at my institution, going to college is treated as just a tax. So there's no intergenerational linkages here, right? Those could be put in, but you'd have to be smarter than I am, so maybe tomorrow. You get within each period, through a standard dynamic programming model, optimal consumption as a function of the state variables, optimal labor supply as a function of the state variables. You get the initial value of the program, right, and that's the metric that we're comparing. Okay, so I think I've said all of this already, so there's no reason to belabor it. The caveats, of which there are quite a few. So I've modeled this as if it's perfect, it's subject to the uncertainty, it's rational, it's forward-looking. The insurance value would still exist if people were myopic. In fact, the insurance value would go up all of the concerns about disincentives, those would go down. So I think this just happens to turn out that it makes the estimates a little bit more conservative. For simplicity, there's only one asset. Even in reality, retirement assets are not included in the financial aid formula, either one of them. And there are things in the United States that, again, are named after the part of the tax code. There are so-called 529 plans, which are included as the parent's assets, but they can accumulate free of tax. So if you've heard the phrase a Roth IRA, this is like a Roth IRA for saving for college, which I find to be bizarre public policy, but they exist and they are ignored. There's no uncertainty in college tuition. That sounds like it's a big deal. I would suggest that for the modeling purposes, it's less of a big deal. For one, in the model, it is focused on the college tuition is fixed in real dollars, right, which is not quite the right approximation. But the key elements of the formula also are basically indexed for inflation. And in most of the cases we care about, there's some aid being given in all cases. And so if that's the case, then the sticker price is kind of irrelevant. It only matters what's in the formula. So, yeah.
Just to clarify on that, so there's no risk in the formula because the formula varies across institutions. You don't know which institution your kid's going to go to.
Correct, correct. So what the exact formula is, that has been standardized, right? And that is also a simplification.
Okay.
Right, so. And then finally, the school meets all demonstrated need. And so this is a competitive selling point among well-financed universities in the United States, which is the gold standard is to admit students without regard to ability to pay, and to meet all demonstrated need off of the formula, right? So there are some places where one but not both of those things happens, and so that's the way we talk about it. If you were at a school that did not meet all demonstrated need, then those marginal incentives for saving and labor supply might be affected quite a lot, but the insurance value comes from all the inframarginal payments as well, and so that would be a little less affected. Okay, so solving the model, I would argue that everything I'm going to present to you is fairly standard. The one parameter that I calibrate is this theta parameter, which is governing how much you value leisure relative to how much you value consumption. I pin that down by insisting that in the variable labor model, the average amount of labor supply is the same as in the fixed labor supply model, right? So when I do comparisons across those two types, it's not that, well, in one case there's more aggregate labor supply being provided. These are CEAR-RSI within. This is full-time income. This is a measure of how much you work relative to full-time. This is a measure of cash on hand, X. This is the cost of going to college. I impose liquidity and hours constraints and do some sensitivity tests to that. Okay, standard AR1 process for the shocks to income with a persistence parameter rho, IID normal shocks. Permanent income P is moving at a very simple constant growth rate. This is the source of all the uncertainty in the model. It's just pre-retirement AR1 income uncertainty. Right? And so there are some later papers that suggest that that might be overstating the amount of uncertainty households actually face, and so there's some work to be done to demonstrate robustness to the form of the income uncertainty. Solution method is just dynamic programming, backwards recursion. My programming skills are such that I prefer to do this as two separate subperiods, focusing on the consumption choice and the labor leisure choice separately. And in the paper I detail some of the simplifications, principally to the income tax formula that are required, but I feel like the model is more clearly solved in this way. Okay, and so the first order conditions are going to equate the marginal utility of consumption equal to the discounted after-tax return times the expected marginal utility of consumption net of, and if you wanted to see it, that is the financial aid tax. 1 minus the derivative of the amount you have to pay with respect to assets. Okay, so as you would expect, the asset tax is going to affect the first order condition for optimal consumption. And the other first order condition is for labor, so the marginal utility of leisure has to be equal to the marginal utility of consumption multiplied by the term that looks like the wage, net of all the taxes. So that's the derivative of the payroll tax, the income tax, and the financial aid formula with respect to income. Okay, so now it has been collapsed into language we all work with. Okay, and so I'm showing in this graph just the life cycle profile for a household that is parameterized to be patient and cannot alter its labor supply. This is assets. You see the spend down while the student is in college. You see smooth consumption relative to income that grows and then falls at retirement. What you notice if you allow labor to vary is the holiday, right? If you are going to be subject to an additional 30% labor income tax, it would be reasonable to expect that you work less. This model allows for that to happen. You also might notice that the peak is a bit lower. The ability to vary labor supply in response to the realization of uncertain shocks means that you don't have to do as much precautionary saving. You can see as well the spend down of assets in part while the student is in college. I'll skip this table. So one measure of the insurance value, the welfare consequences of the current formula, is to sort of zoom in on a piece of the consumption function, right? So what you saw in red previously is this in blue. You can see that consumption falls slightly while the student is in college relative to the red, which is the alternative, that counterfactual that is revenue equivalent, right? And if you just compare them, you note that early in the life cycle, when consumption is low relative to its eventual amounts, you're consuming even less under the revenue equivalent alternative, and more when it was at the parts of the life cycle when it was high, so you know you're sort of worse off if the revenue is equal. The green, which is barely perceptible, is how much higher consumption is in the utility equivalent scenario, meaning where I've given you not just the blue bar, but the blue bar plus the red bar. And if you take the present discounted value of that consumption increase, it's about 1.3% of consumption. Right? So that might travel better as a measure of the welfare consequence into a literature focused more on lifetime consumption. Other metrics, asset accumulation is a third lower on the eve of college attendance. That was my attempt to try to figure out where this would be in terms of, say, Feldstein's original result, which suggested as much as a 50% reduction. So it wasn't crazy, but it also, as is endemic in that literature, the lack of savings isn't by itself an indication of a welfare loss, because you're reducing both the life cycle saving, which you desire to do, and the precautionary saving, which you would have happily not done. Okay, but the total number is 33%. The standard deviation of consumption is 8% lower under the current formula compared to the utility equivalent scenario. Okay, so that's another metric of what the formula is doing. And then this we saw. This I would regard as the main result. The 30% number that I carry around as illustrative is based on this bar, in which it's the 9.8 relative to the 31.6. That's about 30%. Okay, so I've shown you that. I now need to show you parameter sensitivity. So this is the bar that I've been showing you previously. This will fix labor supply. We don't know what the effects will be. These two will change the motives for life cycle saving. We don't necessarily know what's going to happen there. These are the ones where we do know what's going to happen, because I'm directly changing either the amount of uncertainty or the welfare implications, right? The damage to your utility from facing the uncertainty. So these should change. It's not a sign that the model is not robust if these change. And down at the bottom are some changes in other aspects of the budget set. So what do we discover? If you fix labor supply, you're going to accumulate more assets. You accumulate more assets, you're going to pay more. You fix labor supply, you can't take that little holiday while the kid's in college, you're going to have higher income, you're going to pay more. That's all true, that's all in the background. But what you notice is that the compensating variation, that welfare measure, is still positive and it's still reasonably large. Okay, so the extent to which you think you could actually, or people would take that little holiday, right? I have in mind secondary earners dropping out or cutting back their labor. That's not going to affect the main result qualitatively. I could make you less patient and thus reduce the amount that you save, probably based on the table I skipped over, increase the amount you work slightly, but you're going to pay less for college, right? Because you've saved less, principally. But it turns out that the welfare consequence of the insurance is just as high for you. Or I could cut the replacement rate from 50% to 25%, and you're going to have to save more for life cycle reasons, you're going to pay more for college, but the compensating variation, again, is about the same size. Okay, so in the sense of robustness, I mean robustness to other motives for, the ability to vary your labor supply, or other motives that are affecting the amount of savings that you have. Okay, so the red numbers, I know you were expecting me to go to those first. Obviously, we know that if income uncertainty is 0, the welfare consequences are negative. I've shown you that at a baseline amount of a 15% standard deviation, which is sort of standard in the literature, the way people simulate these models, the compensating variation is high. So at some point, it's going to exactly balance out. For the rest of the configuration of parameters, that turns out to be a number like a 6% standard deviation, right? And that's no fault of the model or the concept. That's just how much uncertainty there would have to be along that dimension in order for this insurance value to appear. I could have done an analogous change, to decrease the persistence, right? You make the shocks more permanent, bigger welfare consequence. You make them less permanent, smaller welfare consequence. I mean, the work that Fatih Guvenin has done with large universes of earnings histories suggests that all of these numbers that are in the 90% and up range might be too high. So that's something for me to look at. If you decrease the curvature of the utility function, you're gonna lower the compensating variation. Okay, so in the minute or so that I have left, I'd like to talk to you about this question, which is actually just motivated by what Aaron Edlund described in his 1993 JEP paper. He said, look, if you use something like average income instead of assets, you would be getting to this measure of the potential to save, but you would be ignoring the decision to save. That might make you better off. All right, and so I have in mind that in an extension of this paper, I'll think about what could you do better for people if you had access to, say, their Social Security earnings histories, right? And that comes from this notion of, I'm just going to ask the group. I show up at college with $70,000 worth of parental income, but in one scenario, I have $150,000 worth of assets. In another, I have $20,000 worth of assets. To exclude assets from the formula would be to treat those people equivalently. Some of that $150,000 might be due to more thrift relative to the $20,000, but for the same amount of income, you're also picking up two very different lifetime profiles, lifetime realizations of income. Under any reasonable circumstance, you would expect that a given person, if he didn't know which one of those he would be, would welcome the opportunity to pay more when assets are 150 than when assets are 20. And so I don't think you're going to get much mileage out of just removing the asset tax unless you do what Edlund said, which was to put in something else that can approximate that. So in future work, the problem that I'm going to look to solve is an adjusted available income that has weights on all three of those, and then to consider the provider's problem, which is how do I set up an optimal formula. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for Andrew for this nice presentation. And actually, I would have preferred to do my discussion before. That way, I would have sounded more intelligent. But so you'll see some of the comments I have. You've actually responded to them in your presentation. Nonetheless, so when Philip asked me to look at this paper, I know that in the back of his mind he had, you know, who do I know would care about financial aid going to university? Could it possibly be someone who has not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, but 6 kids? So I do care personally about the results of this paper. So quick summary, just to make sure. So the way I will structure my presentation is basically comparing the means, what I will call the means tested financial aid, so the current formula, to what would be a lump sum tuition discount. Okay, so these are terms that are used in the paper that Andrew didn't use in the presentation, but these are the two, you think of it as these two ways to look at it. And means tested aid formula, the current formula, provides more financial support to the poor people, and because being poor is the result of being unlucky, it's a random draw, it's not because you're lazy, it's not, you're basically stuck with an unlucky draw in the states of the world. There is an insurance here. Talking about insurance, I'm really happy that Andrew started by saying there are 2 words here that usually don't go together, and they're insurance and financial aid. I thought he was going to say insurance and value. And as president of the American Risk and Insurance Association, I would have been, you know, offended by that. So my take on the contribution, very thorough life cycle exercise. What is known, a lot of things are, when I say known, I mean they're fixed. They are known and they don't change, there's no risk on it. Risk-averse household is born at year 0, they retire at year 40, the kid goes to college from year 20 through 23, they die at year 60. So these are fixed parameters. Return on savings is constant, risk aversion is constant, work aversion is constant, or leisure preference is constant, whichever you want. It's the L bar minus L. Increasing in convex tax rate follows the 2013 tax code in the US. There's no borrowing. Andrew didn't talk about this in the discussion, but it is important because we can think of people borrowing early in their career, early in their lives. But it's okay. What is stochastic? It's income, and what is chosen is labor and consumption. And as you see here, in the way that it is modeled, a lot of things are fixed, and I understand the exercise, and it's important at one point to fix things, but the only randomness is essentially the income process. And this is where I'm going to take my cheap shots. I'm going to start with my cheap shots.
You're an economist, that's what we do.
That's what we do. We start with and you started with the first cheap shot, saying that all universities don't behave the same way. Yeah, I forgot to put that in. I thought that was even cheaper, but you know, I'll go with the return on assets is not. Longevity is not fixed. So people don't live exactly 60 years after year 20. I mean, this is not. And kids don't all go to college. I understand the exercise. I understand the principle. But there is also other reasons why people would save, and other means, other vehicles that would provide insurance against other events in your life. So I'm not sure that in the end, I do understand, again, I do understand the exercise, and it's a very valuable exercise. I did learn a lot from it. But I mean, some of this, maybe there is some value in putting some randomness in, let's say death. Just when do you die? Or kids don't go at all to college, and at one point you've saved through those Cloverdale plans, and in the end you have to cash the money in. So there are penalties associated with that. Now there's a quick notation shot with respect to the tax rate, but this is kind of trivial. So here are the shots that I consider that are fair. So they're legal shots. You entered this, why leisure than consumption? I didn't understand that it was just for simplicity. Fine, I get this. So the one thing that that you do look at, and there is some, is when there's no volatility in income, people would prefer the lump sum. That we've known this, and Why? And there's no reason to have insurance because you know there's no volatility in it. The other thing is that you have patient versus impatient. You didn't talk about it this much in the presentation, but you have patient versus impatient household. And I'm not sure this is the best use of introducing heterogeneity in the individuals in this model. I think that the best way to introduce heterogeneity between households is exactly through the volatility in their income, in your AR1 process. And I think, and you've said it's 6%, well, so there must be a sigma reverse hat, or like, what would that be, Croatian sigma, such that people are indifferent between the two systems, the current financial aid system and the lump sum. Which brings me to, well, if that is the case, well, maybe it would be interesting to see if you wouldn't need to, it wouldn't be interesting to introduce heterogeneity in saying that individuals all have kind of a household-dependent volatility in their income. Meaning what? Meaning that, and I know you know it is because you've cited some of those papers in your, that different levels of income don't face the same volatility. I know you're using the 15% standard deviation from the middle income, but it's not, I mean, the high income, my understanding is that it's much higher volatility in income for a higher than for the lower. But, I mean, I'm an insurance economist, so not a labor economist, but my understanding is that at least in dollar value, there's a lot more volatility for high income earners than the low income earners. Well, then that begs the question then that given that we know that without volatility, you prefer the lump sum, and because it is the less wealthy individuals that gain most through financial aid and would prefer the insurance, but there are the ones that have the less volatility, it's not sure to me, again, insurance economist, it's not sure to me that there is not, that you're not exaggerating a bit the welfare loss associated from moving from the current financial aid system to the lump sum payment. So it would be interesting in terms of comparison is which types of households would benefit from the lump sum and which type of household would benefit from the current system. And just saying that what type of household has a high volatility in income? Okay, so the alternate, and here is, the way I see it, there are other places, and I love the fact that you talk about in the paper of the 519 plans and the Cloverdale account. I didn't know about them, so I did check them out. I knew about Canada's system, so we'll get to this. But these are, and for instance, in Canada, you said that you don't understand why 519 plans make any sense. The entire Canadian system is their 519 plans. They're even worse off or better than that. Well, but this is how we save for college for the kids. So I thank you for mentioning this, and I do realize you don't want to talk about it, but I think that because you're bringing in counterfactual, it would be interesting to have other types of counterfactual. And here I'll talk about the Canadian system, which basically takes some of the advantages and disadvantages of the US system and makes it worse, both ways. So we do have this Registered Education Savings Plan. Sorry, I know the acronym in French, I just have to think when I do it in English. There's tax sheltered plan, and not only are they tax sheltered, you also have, and this is important, the government will add from 20 to 40% to the amount you've saved. I do not believe those 519 or Cloverdale accounts do that, or at least because they're state specific, maybe some states do, some states don't. I don't know, I didn't go through the 52 different plans that you have in the US, or let's say the 50 states plus DC plus maybe Guam or Puerto Rico, or more depending on the province. So there is a maximum, But at the same time, you do have that tuition in Canada. No, I don't believe there's any university that charges 60,000, even if they're Canadian dollars. I don't know. Alberta? No, okay. No one charges 60. So I mean, of course, these amounts are much smaller, but possibly the incentives are similar. At the same time as you have these institutionalized Canadian government-run RESP or 519 equivalent to 519 plans that receive a subsidy per kid per year. So let me tell you that I've been using, I'm a net tax collector these days. You get on top of that possibly financial aid that depends on the student's labor income, his parents. I don't think wealth plays a role, at least not in Quebec. It doesn't play a role. I don't know in other provinces. I didn't go through all the other lesser provinces. But in Quebec, wealth doesn't play a role. That's a Canadian joke. As well as a student income, and this is important, as well as a student income that he receives, or he or she receives from the RESP. So this is interesting because you basically subsidize parents. You have the entire problem that Andrew presented. Oh, it may reduce labor, it may reduce consumption, it creates disincentives in some ways. But the Canadian government says, oh, no, but in order to fight this disincentive, we'll add 20%, or in some provinces, or in some certain labor income class, we'll add 40% to your contribution. Oh, cool, that's kind of nice. But when it comes a time to cash in those RESP, you basically have, and I did the exercise on the Quebec, on the Quebec system, so just doing the exercise, I was reading the formula and I said, it seems to me that at some point the tax rate is exactly 100% on the RESP. And I thought that can't be possible. So I went onto the Quebec system, government, I just added the numbers, put it in. And it's true, the clawback can be 100%. You basically put the money in and the government just cuts the financial aid completely. And it's not about the labor income, it's because income from investment, which the RESP is fully taxable. You don't even have labor income that is, no, it's fully offsettable on the financial aid system. Thank you for the paper. I mean, it gave me great ideas, and I know applying this to the Quebec system, we will have, or the Canadian system as a whole, I'm saying Quebec because we're weirder than most, but for all Canadian provinces, I think the system is approximately the same. Because we all have this RESP, and at the same time we all have financial aid, and this is at the government level. I'm not even sure that there wouldn't be more than 100% if each university also uses the same situation in order to cut back on financial aid to the students. So I think this is a great exercise. And in that process, there's a lot of work already involved. Maybe looking at other alternatives. And I do think that these 519 plans, they do change something. I'm not sure, because it also creates a weird incentives as to when you will collect the money you've earned in 519 plans. You may not want to collect early. You say they exist, well, then maybe it's considered part of the wealth. I don't know, I didn't go. But you don't necessarily collect the income, and maybe you're going to wait until the last year of college before you actually collect the entire 519 plans results. So it does create some nice incentives, and I do believe that there is something to be said about looking at other alternatives. So finally, two crazy ideas, and I see I have 40 seconds left. Crazy idea. You have basically the structure of overlapping generation model. And I know you know this, because you've chosen the numbers so that it fits. So it's basically, yeah, you're at year 0, and at one point you have a kid, and the kid goes to college, he graduates from college, etc., etc. So I'm thinking that wouldn't it be interesting to see if, in terms of legacy, in terms of multi-generational problem, if one or the other rule would not create these compounded effects that would make families richer or poorer. finally, the one last thing, and I say I'm down to zero, human capital return. So perhaps if we do believe that human capital is like any other capital, higher income is higher volatility, well, maybe you could just add this as one way to run the system and capture the idea that higher income earners have more volatile income. But again, I'm not sure this is empirically true, but you know, would be fun to look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. I think we have a few minutes, Andrew, if you just want to take a few questions from the audience, or maybe...
I'd be happy to collect all the questions. I mean, this is the consumption part for me.
A couple of points. I really love the paper, particularly because it had welfare in it, and I'm an old-time welfare person. We don't see that nearly enough. I thought one of the low-hanging fruits that you really must look at, maybe this is a follow-up paper, is the equity effects of this. But you'll have to obviously add heterogeneity, and Martin had some fabulous suggestions there to add heterogeneity. But of course, that's kind of one of the social objectives of this whole thing, and you've got this certain equivalent, which is a utility scale, in there, so you can do that really nicely. And of course, his point about the intergenerational impacts are just an extension of that. At a technical level, though, I was very concerned that you did not mention in extensions a couple of things, apart from varying from EUT to rank dependent and exponential to hyperbolic, apart from those sort of obvious things. The additive intertemporal utility function, and the CEAR-RSI utility function, those are the two technical things I'd be deeply concerned about. With an additive intertemporal utility function, you're only talking about atemporal risk aversion. You can't draw the distinction between atemporal and intertemporal risk aversion. I'm not talking about the exotic specifications finance people use. Just a simple non-additive specification is going to be really important because you're talking about long-term effects. That was a point Martin made and you made as well. The second concern is that since you're dealing with savings, using constant relative risk aversion means you've not only got constant risk aversion, you've got constant relative prudence, which is something you want to relax. So there, the simple solution is move to something like an expo power, which is a combination of CEAR and CEAR-RSI. Therefore, you get flexibility. You can allow relative risk aversion to deviate from relative prudence. That would be critical in your sensitivity. Very finally, in Table 8, please vary gamma without varying mu. That makes a huge difference. You vary them both together. That actually removes the substitutability within the utility function. So I think, and since it's relative risk aversion that's driving everything here, I really want to see in Table 8 variations just of gamma.
Yeah.
So it wasn't clear in the presentation, and maybe you can say something about how often did the event where the parent does not have enough money to cover the tuition, how often that happens. And I was thinking of another insurance motive in the model, which I think is not there currently, which is, think of, as a parent, you have two potential schools where you want to send your kid, one that is very expensive but has higher quality in terms of education and one lower. And so if that risk occurs that you can pay the expenses, then that's an added insurance value where if you have a means-tested type thing, where potentially you can still send your kid to the expensive school. So I think it's simple in the model to add in the utility function. Like it could be some sort of trigger, a discontinuity in the marginal utility consumption. In the end, that's what this is. And that would, I think, potentially increase even more the insurance value to the extent that this event happens in the simulation.
Can I make some responses? So thanks to Martin for the comments and to Clement, to Pierre Carl. Yes, I think on the question of redistribution, the way I was describing it, or the motivation was, can I provide an explanation for the value of financial aid that doesn't rely on interpersonal redistribution? Mm-hmm. And so that's the illustration. I think that's valid. And I think the other piece of what you were describing fits nicely with what Martin was saying to me, which is, okay, so at some point you have to create the actual population of actual people with their actual income processes, and to add the last comment, the actual college choices that they would face. And so yes, once we sort of move out of this phase of just illustrating the concept, then I'm obliged to get that exactly right and give legitimate population estimates for all of those characteristics. And I think that incorporates most of Martin's comments, except to say thank you for highlighting that the Canadian system and others would be also interesting to focus on, just as one-off comparisons without necessarily the full attack on what is the optimal formula. And so I thank you all for the comments, and I'll look forward to more discussions in the breaks. Thank you.
Thank you very much.